Brent Venables and his staff are working hard to make sure 6-7 does not happen again in 2023. Welcome to our Sooners show right here at the Voice of College Football OU. We come your way each and every Wednesday, 12:30 Eastern, 11:30 a.m. where it counts. And of course, Jason Ray's the guy that makes this all happen, our Oklahoma postgame live show host and our host for our Sooners Live right here as we creep in on 100 episodes. Jason, how you doing today?
Doing good, Mark. How about yourself?
Doing just fine. Doing just fine. Yes, much to talk about. Personnel acquisitions and coaching changes. So, guess we can start with the coaching staff and Emmett Jones coming in from Texas Tech as a new wide receiver coach.
Yeah. So this was something that had been not necessarily with Emmett Jones, but something from a wide receiver coach perspective that's been in the works for a while. I think it was known probably over the last few weeks, maybe even the last month, towards the end of the season, that Oklahoma probably would be looking to go in a different direction in terms of the permanent wide receiver coach. Obviously, LaDamian Washington came in an interim role after Cal Gundy resigned. Really honestly, with just a couple of weeks before the first game was ready to start, ready to kick off in the year. So, they've elected to move forward with Emmett Jones, and really good young coach. Right, he was the interim coach for Kansas when kind of everything happened with Les Miles. Then he continued to stay on staff there with the new with the new regime, with and as a wide receiver coach. And then Joey McGuire offered him a position at the same role at Texas Tech last year, and then obviously took this position with Oklahoma. So obviously it's a step in the right direction for Emmett Jones, but really a guy who is just known as a very terrific recruiter in the Dallas area of Texas. So that's one thing that I think you're going to continue to see with Oklahoma when they bring guys in. It's going to be dynamic recruiting and really kind of up and coming coaches specifically at this position. So it's something that talking and hearing from some of the Texas Tech people and really from some of the Kansas people, is a guy that Texas was really wanting as well, potentially to add to their coaching staff from a wide receiver coach. So I think there's a lot of people that are even specifically from Texas Tech that know and think that this is going to be a very, very big loss for Texas Tech. So good gain for Oklahoma. I think on the heels of that, they did get a commitment that we'll talk about here in a little bit, but from the transfer portal. But yeah, I think that was one of the areas, Mark, that you thought that Oklahoma probably would look at making a change from a permanent coaching perspective, and it happened right there right here in the midst of transfer portal season.
Yes, and the addition that is linked to the wide receiver group, of course, is ANDREL Anthony. So we've got 3 additions to talk about. 2 that we did discuss last week as being huge possibilities. The one that we did not was the incoming wide receiver ANDREL Anthony from Michigan, who didn't catch a ton of passes there with the Maize and Blue. But if you look back on his background, he did flash in some bigger games. If you go back to the Michigan State game of 2021, he had a breakout game and showed quite a bit there of his potential. And so he makes his way to Oklahoma.
Yeah, as you mentioned, he's got a decent amount of size, 6'1", 6'2" guy, 185, 190. And you mentioned, I think his standout performance was in that Michigan State game, and specifically that that long touchdown pass reception that he got in that game. But yeah, I think it's obviously a position of need that we've talked about that even more so with Marvin Mims declaring for the draft last week. So you look at Oklahoma's receiving core, there the loss of Theo Weiss, the loss of Marvin Mims, and now they're going to continue to bolster, this roster from a receiver perspective. I would certainly anticipate outside of him, Mark, there might be a couple more that Oklahoma's been in the kind of um, in the discussion with. There's a transfer wide receiver out of Bowling Green that Oklahoma was really in on. I think Oklahoma ended up passing on him. As last I've heard, the 6'7" kid, one of the tallest receivers in the country this year. So, but Oklahoma ended up passing on him. There's a couple of other guys that one that's already in the portal that it's looking maybe trending a little bit more in Oklahoma's direction, and this is um, interesting that it's Bryson Green from Oklahoma State, so could potentially be the second guy from your rival school going over going across the territory line, so to speak, to go to Oklahoma. So he's a guy who was one of their leading receivers last year for Oklahoma State. And then there's another receiver from Texas Tech that could potentially follow Emmett Jones over to Oklahoma. He's not in the portal yet, but there's some indications that that could potentially happen. So it's something. It's an area of need, along with I think defensive line is going to be something that they look at as well, particularly at the defensive tackle position, that they continue to look at in terms of possibilities. But yeah, coupled with some of the younger kids, Andrel Anthony and whoever else Oklahoma ends up offering and is able to get into Norman is a group that they're looking to get a little bit more productivity across the board. With right, I mean, you've got Marvin Mims and Jalil Farouk that were your major contributors this year for Oklahoma. But then you've got some other kids that have an opportunity. Drake Stoops is that he's always going to be kind of that possession receiver. He's not going to be 1,000-yard guy, but he's a guy that's going to 500-600 yards. But I think the main thing through some young guys and through some of the recruiting classes and then transfer portal, we'll see how some of these guys end up developing from year one to year two. You got Nick Anderson, who didn't play a whole lot, played a little bit in the bowl game. You've got Jaden Gibson, big tall receiver that didn't see a ton of action. But I think there's going to be the expectation that some of those kids, Jaquazi Petaway, the 4-star wide receiver recruit, has an opportunity to be a little bit more of a deep threat for Oklahoma. So it'll be interesting to see how they continue to bolster that room with some of these potential transfers here in the portal.
Bryson Green, in particular, had one catch against Oklahoma this past season for 11 yards. Had his biggest days against Texas Tech. 5 catches, 115 yards, and a touchdown. Had a huge day against Texas as well. 5 catches, 133 yards. That was a game Texas Tech trailed by 2 touchdowns in the fourth quarter. I'm sorry, Oklahoma State, Texas. It's the same script. It's Texas. Actually, that's also with Oklahoma State, a game that Oklahoma State trailed by 2 touchdowns against Texas and came back and won that one against the Longhorns. He also had a 105-yard day against Kansas with 9 receptions for the Cowboys. So 3 100-yard reception days and all in Big 12 play for Bryson Green. Jason, the couple guys that we discussed last week did go ahead and make their decisions. That would be Rondell Bothroyd from Wake Forest, really productive defensive lineman, and Devin Sears out of Texas State along the defensive front.
Yeah, Mark, two big, I think, big time additions for Oklahoma around on that defensive line. Devon Sears is a guy that is you look at the team that he played for the last few years, and it could be one of those things where you start to I don't know, maybe roll your eyes a little bit. We're going Oklahoma's going after a Texas State kid, but he was very, very well thought after from the portal. Had offers was between Oklahoma and Penn State, and then Tennessee was the third. Not necessarily third in that order, but the top three um, teams that he was looking at. So really, really good company that Oklahoma got with him. So he's a guy that should be able to help obviously from a depth perspective, but should be able to go in and compete at that defensive tackle spot where Oklahoma lost quite a few folks, but still performed pretty well towards the end of the season with some of those younger kids. It's a group that really got better. And then you look at Rondell Bothroyd, was a guy, I think 6 or 7 sacks last year, has over 14 sacks in his last 2 years for Wake Forest. He's a guy that you think Mark will probably be a plug and play guy, a guy that you would assume with his productivity at Wake Forest would have every opportunity to be an instant day one starter. So Oklahoma's made a lot of headway on the defensive line and understood, very, very clearly where there was some, potential gaps, deficiencies, and guys that, probably aren't at the level that they need to be to play at the University of Oklahoma. So they're going to continue to do that. There's still some. I would still expect there's a couple of defensive tackles that Oklahoma continues to be in the mix with from a transfer portal perspective. But both of these guys are really good ads for Oklahoma here, and they'll continue to look for guys on that defensive line because as we know and as we've seen in the national championship game, that offensive line and defensive line is going to continue to be things at a high level that allow you to compete. You're going to, I think, at a school like Oklahoma, you're going to have skill position players that are comparable to some of those guys, but where kind of where the rubber meets the road is going to be on the offense and defensive lines. And so Oklahoma will continue to be active. I'm sorry, I can't speak today. Continue to be active there on the defensive line, and then there's a couple of guys on the offensive line that they're going to continue to go after and look for in terms of depth to kind of build that unit as well.
Well, Jason, I sure hope you can speak today because I can't vouch for myself on this particular day. So one of us needs to carry it, and it's usually you. So, all right, good stuff. We will, of course, make the priority to talk Oklahoma football here, but we've covered the three recent acquisitions plus the wide receiver coach from Texas Tech. So if you've got your comments and questions, we will pick them up. Otherwise, we might as well just move on to this. What do we call it? A so-called supposed national championship game on Monday night. Not to disrespect TCU, but man, that was way beyond anything I could have imagined. And I thought my imagination of what a blowout could look like was pretty severe. But I don't know that anybody forecasted that, and most people were pretty much marking it up as a Georgia win. But my goodness, that when you get through a championship game like that and there's really no use even discussing any kind of decisions, any game management, any clock management, any just none of it really mattered. Todd Monken could have been arbitrarily pointing at plays and just throwing them out there. It seems it was just way beyond an annihilation.
Yeah, it really was, Mark, and it was, I mean, I think shocking in a lot of different ways. Obviously, not shocking that Georgia won the football game, right? I think, but I think it obviously in the manner we both thought. I know that we talked on here last week that we thought um, it would be one of those. It would be one of those things that we could see a blowout potentially happen, and by blowout, I think we both thought maybe 17, 21 points, but it would be something that it was a fairly close game going into the fourth quarter, and then a couple of things happened. But to your point, did not expect this to happen, at all. Um, it looked like Georgia talent wise up front talent wise at the skill position. Defensively was just on a different planet than than what TCU was, and a couple of turnovers. We talked a couple of turnovers from Max Duggan, interceptions. Didn't help, but we talked about how good TCU was at the line of scrimmage against Michigan. And we thought that would be a potential area that Michigan would have the opportunity to expose TCU to a certain degree, and certainly wasn't able to do it. And it was almost a little bit of a flipping of the script. But my gosh, 28 carries for 36 yards for TCU in that game, the other night, and just completely dominated by Georgia defensively. And Georgia's a team that has, had struggled a little bit, slightly, on the defensive side of the ball. Ohio State was pretty proficient in what they were able to do. And then a couple of other games, later in the year, LSU comes to mind where they didn't, perform at a super high level. But man, they were ready to go. Stetson Bennett looked great. To your point about being able to make any kind of call and just pointing at anything and it working, and it just kept going on and on and on. And so yeah, not anything at all that I anticipated. It was, I think what I hear, it's the largest margin of victory in the bowl games, definitely a national championship game, in a
Yes.
bowl game in quite some time. I don't remember if it's ever, but
The list that I saw I thought it was in any bowl game ever.
yeah, that's what I thought I saw too. But Um, yeah, I mean, I know that I makes some people around here feel a little bit better about themselves in terms of Big 12 performances and um playoff games, but yeah, it's just Georgia's a machine right now. They're you've got to at least acknowledge, I think, at this point that they've kind of stolen the baton, so to speak, from Alabama right now. And with the back-to-back national championship games, and just the guys that they're shuffling in and out of those offensive and defensive lines, um, is just incredible. And a lot of young kids, and they're going to continue to they're going to continue to be there. Obviously, they're going to have a challenge in replacing Stetson Bennett, obviously, but I think still they've got the guys that they need to have up front at the skill positions, without a doubt.
There was one point in that game where, and this is long since I had lost interest, but of course the game was still on, still paying attention to a certain extent, but it was noted, and it was 1,000,000 to 7 at this point, whatever, 45, 42. And that Georgia had brought in 4 freshman defensive linemen. I don't want to get that wrong. It might have been just 4 freshmen on defense that they brought in, but I thought that they brought in 4 freshmen along the defensive front. This was, again, fairly late in the game,
Hmm.
and immediately they all were all over Max Duggan. Like it didn't seem like there had been any personnel changes whatsoever. It looked like, the first wave of players was still out there. It was just incredibly devastating. It just was crazy how much dominance was out there.
Yeah, no, you're right, and I think that's the bar that's been set, and I think that's the bar with Oklahoma potentially coming into the SEC. Whether that ends up being 24 or 25, that's what you're looking at, that you want to get to, or at least obviously very close to be able to compete at that level. So there's still a lot of work to be done in Norman, but man, they're shuffling those kids in and out and just playing incredible defense in Georgia for sure.
I find this score comment by Robert here somewhat amusing. I don't know if that's to discredit Georgia, that they played Kent State earlier and only won by 17 points. There is no conceivable way to discredit this football team. They just beat Ohio State, and then they won the national championship game by 58 points. So they went undefeated. Really, nobody challenged them outside of Ohio State. Really, that was the game. Uh, they whipped Tennessee, who's a really, really good team. They annihilated Oregon, really, really good team. They were not challenged in the SEC championship game against LSU. Again, they survived the one scare. That was Ohio State, a supremely talented team. I don't know that there's any way to discredit Georgia this season, an undefeated champion. Uh, Kevin, please talk about commitments. We are after. Is there going to be a whole lot, Jason, do you believe, between now and National Signing Day?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there's a kid that they just recently offered, a 2023 kid, but that's the only, and he's a safety, out of the junior college ranks, and but that's the only noise that I've heard. I don't think that Oklahoma is going to do much of anything else in this late recruiting cycle. Now, like as we mentioned earlier in the show, that they're going to continue to be very, very aggressive and very active, in the portal, looking at from a defensive line, defensive tackle, um, offensive line. There's a couple of guys that they're looking at. Matt Rouse, I believe, is his name, is a guy from Stanford on the offensive line that they're looking at. There's another couple of kids that they're looking at from the portal, but I think they're probably done for the most part from a high school and junior college perspective. But don't be Oklahoma's got, I think, 10 commitments from this transfer portal class. Don't be surprised to see that by the time it's all said and done, potentially doubled. So there's going to be some guys that Oklahoma's continuing to be in on, and kids that are going to still be making decisions. There's all kinds of, I mean, it doesn't just happen at Oklahoma. There's all kinds of tampering that's going on. So who knows what that looks like at the end of the day for Oklahoma and some of these, you know, heck, as we just talked about Georgia in terms of how, I mean, there's only so many kids that are getting to play, right? And so you could see some kids from Georgia, could see some kids from TCU or whatever it ends up being. There's still some of those conversations I think that are being had by some of those players and coaches and stuff like that. What that looks like for next year, and so yeah, I think you'll continue to see, I would say, anywhere from 8 to 10 more additions, from that portal. But I think you'll see them come from the wide receiver variety. I think you'll see them come from the defensive line variety. I don't. Maybe the defensive backfield, or maybe at a linebacker. You might see them grab a linebacker or two, especially with. I know there were some comments about that. David Agwebu announced that he was hitting the portal yesterday or the day before. So, and that's not something that's incredibly surprising from what I've heard. I don't think it was as simple as a guy that was processed, but I think it was a guy that knows that there are a few younger kids that are maybe a little bit better positioned to take some of his snaps going forward in the next couple of years, next year. So when you look at guys like Kip Lewis, when you look at guys like Kobe McKenzie, guys like Jaron Kanek, those are some guys that Shane Witter was, he's a really good player. Unfortunately had some injury concerns this year, wasn't really able to play and part of that depth in the linebacker room. But those are all guys that have an opportunity to really get on the field a lot more. And David Agwebu, in all that he did this year, I think he was the second leading tackler on the team. He had his limitations from a side to side movement perspective. So there's some other guys that I think he, just looking at the kind of the writing on the wall, so to speak, thought that there certainly could be there's some situations where he might not necessarily be a starter, not get as much time this upcoming year as he had this year.
Walter Rouse, yes, is the offensive lineman out of Stanford. He's got 39 career starts. He's played over 2,500 snaps. Nebraska's in on him. He was there over the weekend. Iowa's there. Auburn's on the outside, apparently, but it's between Oklahoma, Nebraska, and Iowa, apparently, for one Walter Rouse, who's played a lot of football. Robert, get your point now. I got it. That Robert's taking some optimism that Oklahoma, just a couple weeks removed from the Georgia game, that Oklahoma put a bigger number on Kent State than Georgia did.
Yeah,
So
I mean, you can only do so much with those comparative scores, right? I mean, when you look at one side of that game for Oklahoma, Oklahoma was only up 3-0 at halftime, in that game, and kind of got it together in the second half. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly there's you want to be optimistic. I mean, right? You want to have that, you kind of tread that fine line between being realistic and being optimistic. So there's obviously, I think there's certain areas that you can look at from being a little bit more optimistic as you go into this 2023 season. Absolutely, with the recruiting class, the guys that they got coming back. I know we really didn't get into this. I mean, I'd heard it kind of could go both ways, but I think since we talked last, Dylan Gabriel has announced that he's coming back again next year. So that quarterback competition will be really, really interesting to see. To see where that's at.
Viking 623, has anybody been watching the recruiting Kirby Smart has been doing the last 4 to 5 years? I think we all have. Will Oklahoma recruiting get to that high level? Well, Brent Venables is off to an amazing start. I don't know that he's recruiting quite at Kirby Smart's level, but basically nobody is outside of Alabama and on the periphery, Ohio State. And that's about it. But Brent Venables is making a pretty good go of it right now with about the 5th best class last I checked into it for this 23 cycle. So you all have to be happy with Brent Venables coming off a 6-7 season, able to haul in a recruiting class that's in the top 5 in the nation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's, and I think it was a little bit fool's gold on the defensive side of the ball. The guys that Oklahoma was able to get, um, from in Alex Grinch's tenure, um, because I think go no further than look at the transfer portal. A lot of the defensive guys that Oklahoma had processed, they're either, they're not getting the offers that they're wanting, or they've got 2 or 3 guys that are going to Texas State. Not a lot of Power Five interest in some of those kids. So, I think recruiting is an interesting game, Mark, in terms of, a lot of it's evaluation. Even though um, there's a kid that is a high 4-star, or whatever they are, the evaluation could look different from program to program, and coach to coach. So I think a perfect example is, when you look at, and who knows what's going to materialize from a kid like that, but when you look at PJ Adebare, when Oklahoma initially got in on him last year and started recruiting him, he was a relative unknown, a 3-star kid. At that point, wasn't really high in the rankings, but then since then, just had a monster senior year. And I think before it's all said and done, he's going to be a guy that could potentially end up being the number 1 defensive end in the country from a recruiting perspective. So you look at that in terms of finding diamonds in the rough, or finding guys that really are, really are guys that are, undervalued initially, and then everybody sees exactly how good they are when certain teams start recruiting them. So yeah, you've got some guys that, um, obviously have track record for bringing in and coaching at a very very high level with Todd Bates and with Brent Venables specifically. Jay Valai has done a really good job on the recruiting cycle, a recruiting front as well. So we'll see once you get those guys in. Would not be surprised at all to see a lot of these younger kids, freshmen and sophomores, start being a little bit more prevalent in the in that two deep coming in next year.
Yeah, David, I believe, alluding to the Indiana transfer, Dalen McCullough. He's an outside guy. He's an edge guy.
Yeah, he's an edge guy. I think it's going to be. I think the thing to look for him, and I think him and Jaron Kanik in tandem. I think there's certain areas of thoughts that McCullough could be a kid that has a tendency he could play that cheetah position. But that's something that I think the coaching staff and everybody really likes about Kanik is his ability to play in space and maybe have that possibility as well. So I think those two guys will be very interesting to see how Venables and that defensive staff plug them in. I think there's an initial thought that you may move. Could look at moving Kanik inside and having Deshaun McCullough play that play that edge position for Oklahoma, which what he did at Indiana last year. So I think it's a good problem to have with both of those kids. When Kanik played, he had an opportunity. When he had the opportunity, he played really well. Still learning the position, didn't really even know honestly how to as a true freshman coming in know how to play the position at the level that Venables wants him to play it at. But at the same time, I think the upside is going to be there. So big spring for him coming up, just to see if he's able to take that next step um, to be a starter and be a constant contributor, a consistent contributor for this team.
Absolutely. Appreciate everybody being here. We do this every Wednesday at 11:30 a.m. Central Time, talking Sooners with all of you. So please leave your comments and questions there in the live chat, and also make it on back next week and bring some friends with you. We would love to grow this audience. So please bring some folks with you. Roberto, Brent Venables will have Oklahoma recruiting on Georgia's level by the time Oklahoma gets to the SEC. And once in the SEC, BV will recruit on an incredible level, just saying to recruits, come to OU and play in the SEC. I don't know if it's that easy, but there's because they can go to LSU and play in the SEC, or go to Texas and play in the SEC, and keep going down the list.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, it's definitely not that easy, but I do agree inherently with the point. I don't know. I mean, at Georgia's level I mean, it'll take a few years to get there, right? But I think Roberto, to your point, I think that SEC patch will inherently very much help recruiting, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. Getting some of those guys. And Oklahoma's in. I think the good thing about what they've done, this year, even though it didn't necessarily materialize on the field, but through the last bit of that recruiting cycle last year, and certainly this year, being having that top 5 recruiting class at this point is one of those things where they've been able to get in and have some of those conversations and even beat some SEC schools like Alabama for some kids, right? I mean, you look at even though he's not an SEC, it wasn't an SEC guy, a guy like Peyton Bowen, probably the biggest defensive recruit that Oklahoma's had in the last few years as a 5-star. PJ Adebare, he's been Oklahoma for quite some time. He was a 5-star kid. And then you've got David Hicks, knowing that Oklahoma was very much in the conversation as being a 5-star defensive tackle. And so I think they're and some of the guys, David Stone, that they're going after, that are that they're in a really good shape with as a 2024 guy, who's a kind of a can't miss for Oklahoma. So they're in on a lot of these conversations more so than they've been in the past. And yeah, we've talked about this. They've been in the conversations, but they're on the I mean, they're on the doorsteps of getting a lot of these big time defensive linemen in. So I think to your point here, there's a lot of opportunity to get even better. But some of that's got to get backed up with play on the field. You get a pass. I think most kids, most analysts, most media outlets will give that kind of know the situation. We'll give Venables and the team a little bit of a pass for year one, but if this looks like a 8-5 team next year, then some questions are going to start being asked. I don't necessarily think that that's going to be the truth or that's going to be accurate in what happens. But if it does happen, then schools like Oklahoma, they're not going to be willing, specifically as you look at kind of going into the SEC here in a couple of years. They're not going to be, to the patience isn't going to be as thick as it would be at some other schools. So I say that to say recruiting is they're recruiting as well as you could possibly imagine with the kind of season that they had on the field. Now, if they can make a big jump this year, I think it just in particularly on the defensive side of the ball in terms of that production, I think it gives some of these recruits and some of these an extra thing, something to think about where you're not only looking at what these coaches have done in the past in terms of getting players into the NFL and getting players to play at a very, very high level, all Americans and things of that nature. But then you've also got, the winning on this side of it. No, okay, it is transferable from Clemson to Oklahoma. It is transferable from Jay Valai's perspective from Alabama to Oklahoma. So those are the things that need to continue to happen. I think this year for Oklahoma, and I think you're starting to see with the talent there and kind of the different mentality that those things are hopefully getting fresh blood in and kind of new perspectives and things like that. That you start to see that more and more with this team.
Russ is asking about Ethan Downs. Now, Ethan Downs is extremely productive on the outside. I don't know why he would want to move him inside, but that's his proposal.
Yeah, I think Mark. There's a couple of guys that you kind of think about with Ethan Downs and Reggie Grimes that came in as this year as a couple of guys that most people thought that would make a big jump from last year to this year, and it never really materialized for either of those kids. Grimes had a good couple of um, first games of this year. I think he had 3 sacks through the first couple of games, but never was really able to make a lot of movement. And then kind of the same thing with Ethan Downs. He was just kind of a guy that was out there, didn't make a ton of plays, but kind of at the same time, he's a guy that a lot of people still love from an upside perspective. So we'll see. I don't necessarily anticipate him moving inside, but we'll see. We'll see what that looks like because he will be pushed, and that's the thing. That's a lot of the thing about competition, right? When you know that you're going to get pushed, it's going to make you that much better. It's going to give you that much more sense of urgency to put it together, not only on the practice field, but in the games as well. So I think both of those kids knew what was kind of behind them, and they really did not have the the thought that they were going to get replaced or things like that. So now with some of these guys that Oklahoma brought in, Trace Ford, Rondell Bothroyd, you've got Devon Sears, you've got some of these guys, and whoever else they end up bringing in will be able to push those to in a perfect world to hopefully make each other better.
Just here in the last few days, there are quite a few stories out there on major sites: CBS Sports, The Athletic, Dallas Morning News. One in a discussion with Greg Sankey, SEC commissioner, others basically citing just reasons why Texas and Oklahoma will move to the SEC in 2024. Of course, it's been something that's been discussed. The date was supposed to be 2026, and it came out during the off season that 2024 could be a target, and then there's a lot of factors involving negotiations. One that's being talked about at CBS Sports is that future matchups between the SEC and the Big 12 could shift to Big 12 stadiums. Maybe that's one bargaining chip that they're using to release Texas and Oklahoma, but to get back some attractive games in Big 12 stadiums. But yes, so it's still not set. It's still not in place. But when Brett Yormark is talking about considering it, and Greg Sankey's also talking about 2024, you got to think that I would think that they're pretty confident that they can work out something to get that released earlier, or they wouldn't just be so open in the media to discuss a date of 2024.
Yeah, I think so, Mark. I think, yeah, the fact that you're seeing both, both conferences, to your point, openly discuss it, I think it's something that's certainly a very, very strong possibility. I mean, we talked about this here, when the Big Ten made the announcement with UCLA and USC, coming over. And kind of with a new TV deal that's going to happen, I believe in either 24 or 25, there with, but it made it hard to believe and hard to kind of rationalize that um that the SEC would ultimately be willing to kind of stand pat and just let kind of the Big Ten have a little bit more of the limelight, so to speak. And so, yeah, I would be at this point. I would not be surprised at all to see this happen in 2024. And I think it's best for both sides if you can come to a great agreement. Right. I know that the Big 12 wants to move forward with probably without Texas, Oklahoma, and Texas in the Big 12, right? They want to kind of have their new stamp moving forward with the teams that are going to be part of that conference, and certainly with the SEC, having Oklahoma and Texas and what that schedule looks like, and just continuing. Not only, I mean, they're already the premier conference in the country, but continuing to bolster that, and what that looks like, with them, will continue to be very critical and very important. So I think that will. I would be, again. I've been shocked through some of this process. I kind of thought initially that would happen next year. That it would ends up being here in this 2023 season. But yeah, everything that I'm hearing continues to point to 2024, maybe a little bit more likely than it was maybe a few months ago.
And if that new format for the SEC, once they add Texas, Oklahoma, get to 16 teams, becomes a no division, no pod, just 1 through 16 model that's got a scheduling format similar to what we saw that the ACC is going to institute this coming season in 2023. So for the SEC, that would be a 3-6-6 model. So you would designate 3 rivals for each school, and then you just split up the rest of the conference 6 and 6, and you alternate playing that pack of 6 one year, the other 6 the next year, and you just go back and forth, and then you play the 3 primary rivals every year. I did some quick work on this a few days ago to see where this may land if you make sure you protect all the rivalries, of course, and you also try to make it balanced in regards to the level of play of those 3 designated rivals. And I gave Texas, Oklahoma, Texas A&M, and Arkansas as their three designated rivals, which makes total sense. And anytime you do this, you're going to have some outliers. You're going to be able to work it almost all the way through, but then you're going to have some oddities that you can't avoid because not everybody has the same exact number of rivals. So with Oklahoma, I've got Texas, Missouri, and then I had nowhere else to put another Vandy slot. So I came out with Vandy, and I am not predicting that's the way it's going to land, but we shall see if they go with that, or again, if I believe I've heard several times that the pods are not going to be used for the SEC, or if they just stay with these SEC East and West and reconfigure it and move these two into the West, and then do some other reconfiguring.
Yeah, no, I think, as you mentioned about the pods, that was something that I think initially on the announcement that there was a lot of like momentum in it, but I think that was more kind of, from what I understand and what I've heard, more kind of media created momentum related to, the interest in the pods. But I've heard more, more than anything, there's more, I think, energy towards three permanent rivals, and then just kind of a round robin type of schedule, after that. So I think, that would be, it's really interesting. I think there's a few, a few possibilities for Oklahoma in those, in those permanent rivals. I mean, you know that Texas is going to be one, obviously. So you've got the other two. I mean, I think, you've got Arkansas as a possibility, you've got Missouri as a possibility, you've got Texas A&M, I think, as a possibility. So I think two of those three will be. I think there's moment. I've heard some momentum towards Missouri being one of those yearly rivals for Oklahoma, but the other one's going to be interesting. I know, and specifically, how does that work with Texas A&M? I know there's been some talk about Texas and Texas A&M not necessarily wanting to rekindle that game in terms of like being every year game again, but we'll see. We'll see how that actually plays out, and I think, I think the most interesting thing, and I think Sonny Dykes mentioned this, and I think he got a little bit of backlash, particularly from some of the SEC side of things, was talking about late in the year they didn't have I don't remember exactly what the quote was talking about late in the year they had a tougher schedule from some of these than some of these SEC teams do, as they typically do that next to last week of the year. But I think a lot of people, were pointing at, I think the SEC teams would love to have that schedule that TCU has during the conference season, and not have to go and play, these guys that they have to play week in and week out in a much tougher um, conference and division. So I think that'll be interesting to see from that aspect for Oklahoma and Texas, how they approach non-conference scheduling in the future. Um, with Texas, has had home and homes with Ohio State in the past, have had Alabama previously. Oklahoma's had some with Alabama, has had some with Notre Dame and stuff like that. So what does that look like? Does Oklahoma and Texas, do they start, scheduling? Is it like one FCS opponent, you know one Power Five opponent, and one Group of Five, or is it an FCS opponent and two Group of Five guys early on until they get more integrated, so to speak, in the SEC? I think that will be just very intriguing to watch what that mindset looks like.
I like Sonny Dykes. And I get his point, and it's been made by many people in looking at the SEC taking a week off basically to play scrimmage games, not the entire conference, but a pretty good portion of the conference that second to last week of the season. But that's kind of their own business. And as long as the entirety of the schedule's not a joke, which it's not, based on both a difficult conference, the best conference in America. And then if you add on to that, that the SEC plays just as many difficult out of conference games as anybody else does, if not more, especially when the likes of Georgia, Kentucky, Florida, and South Carolina are doubling up on their rivals in terms of playing the ACC schools that are their in-state rivals, and also typically throwing on another difficult non-conference game. I found it funny because Sonny Dykes makes this claim, and then I look at, not that I needed to look at TCU's schedule, but their 3 out of conference games were Colorado, SMU, and Tarleton. So I didn't know what he was really going for there, but
Yeah, no, I'm with you. It was, I mean, yeah, I understood his point, certainly, but yeah, the holistic view of the schedule wasn't necessarily part of the consideration. I think in that comment that he made.
Russ, I would think that the SEC deciding between 8 and 9 conference games, which of course the SEC plays 8 conference games. So OU's moving from a format in which they play 9 conference games and only 3 non-conference games to an 8 and 4 model. And if it stays that way, I would think that there would be just more likelihood or more possibility that they keep the Oklahoma State rivalry intact. But if the SEC would go to a 9-game conference season, then that limits the flexibility that you have with scheduling a 3-game non-conference slate and trying to keep one for Oklahoma State all the time. I just don't see that happening all the time. I don't think Oklahoma wants to be locked down to Bedlam every year, especially if they only have 3 games to play with.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't think it'll happen. It may be something that happens, once every 5 or 6, 7 years or something like that, just to play. But it's one of the unfortunate parts of conference realignment. I think with the with how tough the SEC is year in and year out, you don't want a game like that. That's Oklahoma State is a typically a perennial top 20, top 25 team. So that's probably not something that Oklahoma is going to be interested in doing. And I think Oklahoma State has, they've come out publicly, particularly Mike Gundy has come out publicly and has said on a couple of different occasions that that they're not planning on playing Oklahoma. So I don't know if that's just him or if that's the athletic department in general, but it doesn't sound like that's something that's going to happen after the move is made.
All right, Jason. Anything else on the docket we need to hit?
No, I don't think so. I think there's just a lot of portal watching going on right now in between now and when spring practice and stuff like that gets going for Oklahoma. So there's, like I said, there's going to be a lot of noise and a lot of things going on related to that we'll be sure to talk about and keep you updated with. And once we get to closer of a solidified roster, then I think we can start, obviously in probably the March timeframe, start having some of those positional breakdown shows and talk through that stuff.
Folks, as is typically the case, we get the most people on the line here at the end of the show. So please just wait for the video to post, which is going to be automatic, I believe, or at least within a couple minutes, and you can catch everything that you missed. Join our Discord. You go to patreon.com, search MarkRogersTV, and you sign up there. It's $5 a month. You can talk Oklahoma football, the Big 12, the SEC, whomever, all the time. We've got 100 people on there talking college football all the time, 24/7, 365. Again, you go to patreon.com and search Mark Rogers TV. You can follow Jason at Jason Ray 1. Right there, you see it on the banner, Jason Ray 1. Follow him on Twitter, and you can catch me at Mark Rogers TV on Twitter. All right, we will be back here next week. We hope you bring some folks with you and join the fun. And Jason, we appreciate you making this happen as always.
Absolutely. Happy to be here. Thank you, Smart.